All right. I think some of you know the experience of what I'm going to talk about right now. I have been praying day and night and day and night and day for God's help, His specific help and intervention in my life. The same thing day after day, week after week, month after month for almost 2 years. Now, before 2 years ago, I was definitely praying for God's help and intervention and all that, but it was about 2 years ago where I got to that point where, like, God, I don't think I can take another step. I don't know if I can keep going unless you specifically and powerfully and obviously intervene, unless you help me. Unless you help me in my life, I just don't think I can take another step. I need you, and I need you now. I need you to step into my life. That's how it felt a couple years ago. And yet still, that help hasn't shown up yet. About 1.5 years ago, I was meeting with some pastor friends of mine, and I was just honest with them, as I try and be, honest with them, and I was like, guys, I just don't think I can keep going. I don't think I can keep going. I need God to help me. I need God to help me and intervene in my life. I need Him to act. I need Him to break through. And so they gathered around me and they prayed for me. And I'm like, I just don't have anything left. And they just prayed and they prayed. And although God didn't act or intervene, He didn't intervene in any specific way, my internal capacity went from below empty to filled up to overflowing. My inner capacity was recharged, and I was able to go in spite of still being desperate for God's specific help and intervention. I didn't get that intervention, but I got recharged so that I could keep going. And since then, I fasted about 5 times, I'm going to say for a week, although, for several days, each time, seeking God to specifically intervene and answer my prayers, and I still need His help. And I've been doing this, and yet, here we are on the 12th of November, 2017, and still He has not intervened in my day and night and day and night and day prayer for help. I think some of you know what that's like. I think some of you know what it's like to be so in need of God's help. So desperate for God's help, for Him to act, for Him to intervene in your life in direct answer to prayers. You feel like you just can't take another step unless He does something. Where you feel stuck, and if He doesn't take another step. I think some of you know exactly what that feels like, to be that kind of desperate for God to help you. Through this time, I have heard 2 very clear words from God. Number 1, I've heard, do not give up, keep going. Do not keep up, keep going. And secondly, I've heard soon. I'm going to act very soon. Very soon. Well, at first, that was like 1.5 years ago, and I'm like, yeah, God is going to act. He's going to act soon, probably any day now, probably today even. And so soon, that's great. And then that day goes by, and nothing happens. And then the next day goes by, and nothing happens, and then the next day goes by and nothing happens, and then it becomes a week, and you're like, okay, He said soon, so He's going to act soon, and I need Him to act soon, and He said He's going to act soon. So a week goes by, nothing happens, and then 2 weeks go by, and then 2 weeks become 3 weeks, and 3 weeks becomes 4 weeks, and you're looking at the end of the month, and you're like, well, definitely God is going to intervene soon, and most definitely before the end of the month, and then the month turns. And you just feel that disappointment and that question, God, why haven't you acted yet? And I know some of you know exactly what that feels like, to be like, God, why have you not acted yet? I need you to act. I need you to intervene. Why have you not acted yet? And then 1 month becomes 2 months, becomes 3 months, becomes 6 months, becomes a year, and you're like, no way. A year. A year becomes 2 years. Some of you have been praying and eagerly needing God's help for a long time, a couple years, maybe even longer. And you might be feeling like I am sometimes, where you're like, God said soon. God said soon, like he's going to act soon in my life, very soon. Keep going, he's going to act soon. I think some of you know what that's like, to hold on to words of hope like soon. I'm going to act soon. When you feel like you needed God's help a couple years ago. And yet nothing's happened, and yet soon. If you've not experienced that, I'm telling you, it is anguish. It is not fun. Solomon writes in Proverbs 13, hope deferred or hope delayed makes the heart sick. And it's true. It's true. Holding on to hope and prolonged waiting when you feel desperate for God's help and for his activity, when it's just delayed, it just feels brutal. It feels disappointing. All through the Bible, we see this concept of soon, that God is going to act soon. Words of hope, words of encouragement, and yet, like, what in the crazy, right? When is soon? How many of your prayers have looked like, when is soon? God, how many times have I wondered if God even knows what the word soon means? I mean, you're looking through the Bible and you're in the book of Revelation and Jesus says, I'm returning soon. And you're like, that's 2,000 years ago. I don't think you know what the word soon means. Not very encouraging when it comes to your choice of words in our passage today. Jesus is going to use the phrase, a little while. A little while. In a little while this, and then in a little while that. And his disciples are going to be like, what is he saying in a little while? A little while this. Because they know phrases like a little while or soon or whatever. They can be anything from like minutes or hours, as we think they ought to be, to days, weeks, years, millennia. Millennia. He's going to use these words, and we're going to see how they respond to this in their confusion. Because they understand that God's choice of words sometimes is clear and yet confusing. We're in a study in the book of John together. We've been going through the book of John for the last several weeks, meaning a little bit over a year. And we are now in John chapter 16, the middle of John chapter 16. And in case you're new or visiting, basically, we are in the last couple hours before Jesus' arrest. They have had the Last Supper. Judas has left to betray Jesus. They have left the room of the Last Supper at the end of chapter 14 of the book of John. They are now either walking to Gethsemane, the garden where Jesus is going to be arrested, where he's going to pray and be arrested. They're either walking there or they have just arrived there, because we are at the very end of this conversation. We just have a few verses today and a few verses next week. And we're at the very end of this final message that Jesus has for his disciples. And so we're at that last moment before Jesus prays for himself. And in this moment, the very end of his chat here, these are the words that he says to his disciples. In John chapter 16, starting in verse 16. Jesus says this, he says, "A little while, and you will no longer see me. Again, a little while, and you will see me." Therefore, some of his disciples said to another, "What is this he tells us? A little while, and you will not see me. Again, a little while, and you will see me. And because I'm going to the Father?" They said, "What is this he is saying? A little while? We don't know what he's talking about. We don't know what he's talking about. A little while." What a phrase. And as I've been saying, throughout the pages of the Bible, we see people just like us asking God things like, okay, God, you say you're going to act, you say you're going to do some stuff, you say you're going to intervene, you say you're going to rescue, you say you're going to save, but how long are we talking about? A little while? What is that? How long? How long, O Lord? How long? How long is soon? Now, we're going to look at today's passage in two different ways. It has a very simple, obvious meaning. And so, I'll just say it really quick. This is not a complicated passage to understand. We know what Jesus is talking about because we're looking back at it and we know what's about to happen. We know that night he's going to be arrested, he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be on the cross in a few hours, less than 12 hours. He's going to be crucified on the cross, and we know the disciples are going to scatter, that Jesus is going to be in the tomb in less than 24 hours, and he's going to be buried, and the disciples are going to be hiding and fearful. We know what's about to happen, and when he says a little while, he actually means like in a couple hours. We know that now. They don't know that. We know that in a little while when he says, and again in a little while, he's talking 3 days, that all of this is going to be unfolding over the next 90 hours or less. So we know that that's what's going on, and as we go through this passage, we can trace over this period of time that what Jesus is specifically talking about. But the thing is that the disciples don't know that yet. And so as they're processing this information, we're going to kind of look at it from their point of view of confusion, even though we can understand it clearly looking back at it. And so we're going to look at it through their eyes, but also with understanding that there's some big themes that are being addressed here that we see all through the Bible and in this passage. And so because the technical understanding of the passage is quite straightforward, I'm going to be looking mostly at these mega themes that are surfacing as we go through this section, as we go through through the eyes of the disciples. And the first mega theme to come up in this passage is what everyone who seeks God in prayer is asking when they're urgent and desperate to hear from Jesus. Point number one, they're seeking to understand the timing. How long until God does what he has said? The disciples are confused. They're like, what is this a little while? What does he mean by this? How long? For my Bible reading group, we are right at the end of the Old Testament. We're going to be done with it this week. Very exciting. Well, for this past Thursday here, part of the books that we were covering is Habakkuk. And it's one of my favorite books in all the Bible. It's actually the first message I ever preached in my life in front of adults was on the book of Habakkuk. And so it has a special place in my heart. It was also to a church of 3,000 people, so a terrifying moment in my life for a first message. Try that sometime. It's freaky. Anyway, so as I was mapping out this message today, I was struck at how a lot of these mega themes are also in the book of Habakkuk. And it's just this three-chapter small book in the end of the Old Testament. And the book begins basically in verse 2 is basically like the main beginning of the book. And Habakkuk's first words are, how long? How long, O Lord? How long, Lord, must I call for help? He says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence and you do not save? Habakkuk knows what God has said about justice and violence. He knows what he said about how he's going to save and rescue, how he's promised to intervene. And yet Habakkuk is praying and praying and praying, asking God, how long? How much longer? How much longer? The disciples are in that same place. In a little while, what does that mean that you're going to do this in a little while? They're confused. I don't blame them. I don't blame them at all. And I'm sure that so many of you understand what it is to pray and believe that God will help you. But you're like, come on, God, how long? When? When are you going to help me? When are you going to help me? And you know firsthand the frustration of waiting and waiting. For them, it was going to be hours and 3 days. And I just hope that that's true for us too. That when God says soon, we're talking like hours and days, no longer months and years. May that be true of all of us. But that's one major theme that we see in this section, seeking to understand the timing. How long until God does what he says he's going to do? The second major theme, and we saw it in the verses that we read there, is this idea of seeking to understand the meaning. When you're pertaining to mysteries and riddles and confusion, here the disciples are like, we don't get it. We don't understand. We don't understand. What is he saying? That's what we don't know what he's talking about. What is he saying? Now, happily for us, Since we have the Holy Spirit, we don't have this problem. We know exactly what God says and what he's meaning at any given moment of time. Is anybody listening? That's not... If that's your experience, that is not my experience. Yeah, God speaks to us, sure, but we still have to wrestle and pray and seek him for, what are you talking about? What do you mean by what you're saying? Asking Jesus, what does this mean? I don't understand. On Thursday night, Ruth was teaching at the internship about hearing from God. It was part 3 in this hearing from God season. Not just hearing, though, but seeking to understand what God is meaning when he's speaking to us, and then even more so, what to do with that word when we not only hear, but we understand, and then what to do with that. For instance, let's say you're praying for the church here. By the way, I hope that you're all praying for the church here. I really, really hope that you're praying for the church here. I mean, there's 100,000 examples of churches that had great moments, and then they crumbled and they crashed and they went into decline. I hope you're praying for this church, the leadership that you're praying for. Okay, let's say we're praying for the church, though, and I'm praying for the church, and I'm saying, God, do you have a word of encouragement for our church? Maybe what are you thinking about our church? What are you doing in our church these days? What are you at work doing in our church these days? So let's say you're praying through that, and I ask for an encouraging word because I'm asking, so might as well be encouraging. As you got an encouraging word. Let's say God gives me the picture of a Siberian tiger, which is true, which is what he did do. And okay, a Siberian tiger. Okay, great. So the obvious question is, God, why? Why a Siberian tiger? And why is Siberian tiger even a thing? I didn't even know if it was a thing, but why a Siberian tiger? I mean, I could make some guesses. Powerful, mighty, strong, isolated, rare, cold weather. But those would just be guesses. God, I hear from you, Siberian tiger. I can picture it in my mind, but what do you mean? But what are you trying to say? What are you trying to say about this? What are you trying to say? And then God says, it's because Siberian tigers have thicker skin than other tigers. I didn't know that. I had to look that up. Thicker skin, stronger, even alone sometimes. And that God is in the process of developing our church to have a bit of a thicker skin, to be able to stand strong even in difficult days, in dark days. Family, if you get a word or a picture from God, okay, great. But you're not done. You're not done. And what you need to do, ask next is, God, what does this picture mean? Or why this verse? Why did you give me this verse for this church? Or why this Bible story? Or why this person in the Bible jumping out? Why are you highlighting this to me right now? And what is it about this that you want me to understand in light of this question that I'm asking you? The disciples hear very clearly from Jesus, but they don't understand yet, and so they're asking this question, what does this mean? What does this mean? Habakkuk does the same thing in his book. He's like, how long, O Lord? How long until you're going to act? And then God answers, and God's answer is basically, I've got a plan. He's like, I've got a plan, and here's the plan. You're right, Habakkuk. I agree with you. Your nation is corrupt. There is violence everywhere, and so here's my plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send an even worse nation, a wicked, violent nation, and I'm going to bring them in here, and they're going to take over and wipe everything out. They're going to just take over. I've got a plan. And they're more corrupt. And Habakkuk's response is going to be, you're going to do what? You're going to do what? That does not sound like a great idea. And so Habakkuk is going to want to start to understand why. Why would you take an even worse nation to destroy someone more righteous than they are? Like, why would you do that? God, what do you mean? Why are you thinking? Why are you thinking? Jeremiah does this a lot in the book of Jeremiah, and other prophets do as well. They get this picture and then seek God in understanding of what it means. One of the great lies that I see in Christians is this idea of, if God is speaking to me, I'll understand it. If God's speaking to me, I'll understand it easily and without effort. And as a result, there's this laziness epidemic in Christianity when it comes to seeking God for understanding. God, they understand the Bible, or, God, I'm reading the Bible. I don't get it. I don't get it, but, I'm sure I would if you really wanted to say something to me about this. I have this dream. I have this picture, whatever. God's been speaking to you, and many have missed so much of what God has been saying. You've missed so much of what God's been saying to encourage you, to fill you with hope, to give you direction, simply because you've not been wrestling in prayer for answers and understanding. Because you've made a practice of asking Jesus, because you've not made a practice of saying, Jesus, what do you mean? What do you mean? Or what are you trying to say to me? Be encouraged by the disciples. If they're confused and Jesus is standing right in front of them, they don't get it. And he said it right in front of them. To them. It's not strange that we're going to need to wrestle for understanding and meaning when God's speaking to us. Like Isaiah prophesies to Jesus' generation, they're going to be people who are ever seeing but never perceiving. They're going to hear, they're just not going to get it. And I think that's true in our generation epidemically. Hearing from God but not getting it, and yet not fighting for that, not wrestling for understanding. Anyways, the Bible's filled with examples of God speaking clearly, but understanding only coming with seeking it. My life, it's the same, and I'm sure it's the same with your lives. I encourage you to dive in, as the disciples do here. In fact, what happens here? Because they're confused, and they're like, we don't know what he's talking about. And then we keep reading. Jesus knew what they wanted to question him, knew they wanted to question him. So he said to them, are you asking one another about what I said? A little while, and you will not see me. Again, a little while, and you will see me. I assure you, you will weep and wail, but the world will rejoice. You will become sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy. When a woman who is in labor has pain because her time has come, when a woman is in labor, she has pain because her time has come. But when she has given birth to a child, she no longer remembers the suffering because of the joy that a person has been born into the world. So you also have sorrow for now, but I will see you again. Your hearts will rejoice, and no one will rob you of your joy. Okay, again, we know what's going on here. We know what Jesus is referring to, that he's going to be crucified, that he's going to be buried, that the world's going to rejoice, and his disciples are going to be full of sorrow. They're going to weep and wail. But we also know on the third day, Jesus is going to rise from the dead, one of the most certain historical events in the history of the world. And when he rises from the dead, he's going to see his disciples. They're going to be amazed and filled with joy. But before there's joy, there's sorrow. Before there's rejoicing, there's weeping, there's wailing. And the disciples are going to live through this heartbreaking time of anguish, soul-breaking agony. And I think some of you know what seasons like that feel like. I think some of you know what it's like to live in a moment of wailing, of brokenness, maybe even like these disciples where they're wailing while others are rejoicing. The same event breaks your heart, and other people are happy about it and they're full of joy. Another mega theme in the Bible is, number 3, seeking to endure waiting and pain, living in sorrow, anguish, and wailing. And if you've ever lived through pain or anguish as a Christian, I bet you know all about why prayers. Why prayers? God, why is this happening? Why are you allowing me why are you causing me to endure this pain? Why don't you rescue me now? Why don't you intervene in my life, in my situation? I don't understand. Why am I having to go through this? Again, it's this mega theme in the Bible. I think about the Apostle Paul often, and it seems to me, in my read of the New Testament, it seems that Philippi specifically, that Paul's thrashing, his physical thrashing in Philippi is at least one of the worst, if not the worst thrashings that he receives. He lives through it, and then he's in prison that night, and they're worshiping and singing, him and Silas, and then there's this earthquake, and ultimately they get out, and the next day they get released. You might be thinking, God, why did Paul have to live through that? I'm sure Paul's like, why did you rescue me now and make me live through that suffering? Why did I have to go through all that suffering before this? And you could be like, well, maybe it's because of the jailer and the jailer's salvation and Jesus, the Spirit wanting to do this thing with the salvation, which is an interesting note, by the way. Very clearly, some of the suffering seasons in your life have nothing to do with you. I mean, God can use them and redeem them, and you can learn from them, but sometimes it's about the jailer and what he's doing in the jailer's life and setting up the jailer to hear the gospel and respond. That's just a side point. But family, if you know what it's like to live through a season of pain while you're waiting for God to save you and rescue you, and you're like, God, why? Why am I having to go through this right now? If you're waiting for God to intervene in your life to help you, if you're waiting, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know what that's like. But don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. Don't let your anguish rob you of your expectation. Don't let the delays rob you of your hope. It's very easy. 1 month, 2 months, 5 months, a year, 2 years. Hope. It's very easy for hope to go down. Don't let your sorrow rob you of your sense of expectation that God is going to intervene. Keep believing. Keep praying. Keep going. Keep believing. Keep praying. Keep going. It's brutal to wait on God in the midst of pain, but He sees you. He sees you. He knows what's going on, and if you hold on, I believe that He will act, intervene, and save you as you call out to Him day and night, night and day and night and day for help. Just don't give up, and don't give up hope. Look what Jesus says, after the sorrow, after the suffering, what happens after that? Jesus says for them it's going to be joy. He says for them it's going to be joy. He says, so you will also have sorrow now, but I will see you again. Your hearts will rejoice, and no one will rob you of your joy. That was in verse 22. No one will rob you of your joy. Mega theme number 4 in the Bible has to do with seeking unstealable joy. Is unstealable a word? You can't take that away from me. Unstealable joy. The future is joy for those who endure. In the book of Habakkuk, it's gone back and forth. Habakkuk has said, how long, O Lord, until you intervene? How long until you act in my corrupt nation? God says, I have a plan. I have a plan. I'm sending these even worse people. Habakkuk is like, you're going to do what? This doesn't sound like a good plan. God says back to him, trust me. And then there's this great chapter 3 poem response that Habakkuk writes to God in his statement of trust. And that kind of ends in verse 17 and 18 and into 19. But what he concludes after hearing that it's going to get bad, that he's going to go through a season of sorrow before the season of joy, he writes these incredible words. And he basically is writing 3 terrible things. Even if these terrible things happen, I'm going to rejoice. This is what he says in Habakkuk 3:17. He says, though the fig tree does not bud and there's no fruit on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, if all 3 of those things happen, yet I will triumph in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. When I taught this to some junior high, some early secondary students about 20 years ago, what I had them do with this passage is I had to make their own version of these verses. And they would write down 3 things that if they looked ahead, they would find dreadful. Like that they would just find so discouraging and dreadful. And they would write down 3 things, and then at the end of those 3 things, so then I gathered them all in and then wrote on the bottom of them, yet I will triumph in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. And handed them all back to them and had them read it through and pray it through. And this idea of if my three worst scenarios take place, these three nightmares took place, and then flowing out the rest, but yet even then I will rejoice. I'll triumph in Yahweh. I'll rejoice in God my Savior. Talk about unstealable joy. Joy even when things are crashing down. There are times, and many of you have lived through times like this, where life is like a living nightmare of pain. But also, some of you have made it through. You've made it through a season of time, and you have found that this is true for you, that you went through a season of great darkness, and yet you found joy on the other side. God had brought you through that valley, and he's brought you out in triumph and celebration. You found that when you feared there would never be joy for you, there was. You found happiness when you feared that there was only sorrow in your future. You've endured, you've come through, you found joy in the God who saved you. If you're in the midst of sorrow-filled days, I just encourage you, don't give in to despair. David writes in Psalm 30, although sorrow may last for the night, joy comes in the morning. So keep believing. Keep going. Keep praying. All through the Bible, we see examples of people moving through great pain to great joy. From great sorrow to great rejoicing. The examples over and over and over again. I believe if you hold on to hope and you keep praying day and night and day for God to rescue, you will be heard. Don't take my word for it. Take Jesus' word for it. In fact, that's the very next thing he says in the next words. It says, and he starts talking about it again in verse 23, in that day you will not ask me anything. I assure you, anything you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. Anything you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. Until now you have asked for nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, so that your joy may be complete. Now, if you've been around here for the last 2 months, you're like, Brian, you're just recycling the same verse over and over again. No, Jesus keeps saying the same thing over and over again about prayer. Ask, and you will receive. In this case, why? Previously, so the Father's glorified, and here, so your joy may be completely full, complete joy. Ask anything. That's the final mega theme in this passage, seeking God's help through prayer. Ask and you will receive, so that your joy may be complete. It's kind of like Jesus is telling his friends who are about to weep and wail and grieve and endure anguish to remember to keep believing, to keep going, to keep praying. You'll be heard. You'll be heard. Don't just hold on, but keep believing. Keep going. Keep praying, and your prayers will be answered, and you'll have complete joy. The right response to sorrow and pain-filled days is continued prayer. Asking God to help bring you through to joy on the other side. I believe that's exactly what some of you were here today to hear. You've battled with when? How long, O Lord? You've battled with what? What are you saying to me, God? I don't understand. You've battled with enduring pain. You've heard about hope and joy, but it seems out of reach to you right now. What do you do in those horrible days? You keep believing. You keep going. You keep praying. You keep asking. You keep seeking. You keep knocking. And according to Jesus, anything you ask the Father in his name, he will give you so that your joy may be completely full. May that be true for all of us. We're going to talk more about prayer next week, but for now I've got a few challenges. Challenge number 1 is this. I want you to do that exercise that I worked with those junior hires years ago, and write 3 big fears you have pertaining to your future. Man, looking ahead, if these 3 things happened, I would find this devastating. These 3 things. Write them down and then add the words of Habakkuk 3:18 after them, yet I will triumph in Yahweh. I will rejoice in God my Savior. And just add that to your prayers this week. God, even if this happens, I will rejoice in you. It's going to be powerful. It's going to be powerful. Secondly, I want you to ask God to bring you out of your season of pain and into joy immediately. You're like, I don't know how that's even possible. You don't have to know how that's even possible. That's God's job. Just call on God if you're in a season of pain for him to bring you out immediately, this week. And thirdly, just keep believing, keep going, keep praying. That's my challenge, and that's probably the biggest challenge some of you have ever heard. Keep praying, keep believing, keep going.